Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Ong, and you're watching a recorded lesson on Stalin's Soviet Union. The objective of this lesson is for you to revisit the content of this chapter at your own time and space, and hopefully this will help your revision for Sec 3, 4, and 5. You might notice that the slides used here are different from the ones that we used in class. That's because Mr. Ong has removed the lesson activities, the different kinds of videos. This is purely a revision lecture that will support your learning. The handouts for these lessons can be found on Google Classroom. If you recall, in this chapter, there are two parts to it. The first part concerns Stalin's rise to power, and the second part, which is the focus of today's lesson, is on the impact of Stalin's rule. The overarching question for the impact of Stalin's rule is, to what extent did Stalin's dictatorship devastate the Soviet Union? We are looking here at how did Stalin's rule impact the Soviet Union? Did it devastate it? Did it have a negative impact, or did it have a positive impact? And this section of the chapter can be split into several parts. This video, we will look at the first two parts. In the first part, Mr. Ong will be teaching you guys about how do you evaluate impacts. What are some ways we can evaluate the impact and extent of a person's rule, whether it be Stalin in this chapter or Hitler in the next chapter. The second portion of this video will be focusing on the economic impact of Stalin. What were his policies of collectivization and industrialization? And what were their impact? Was they successful, unsuccessful, or did they have mixed results? The next two sections will be dedicated videos by themselves. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to evaluate the impact of his rule according to the various contexts: economic, political, and social. Let's start off with, how do you evaluate impact? First off, when your essay questions ask you to evaluate the impact of a certain policy, we must always begin with the aims of the policy. What did it aim to do? What did Stalin try to achieve using the policy? Next, after talking about the aims, we want to determine what was the outcome. Were the outcomes beneficial or not beneficial? Did they succeed? Did they fail? Or did they have a mix of success and failures? What was the outcome? After that, we will recognize that the outcome of policies impact people differently. So we ask the question, who was being impacted? Did everybody receive the impact in the same sort of way? Or did some people benefit more than others? Or did some people lose more than others? Okay. Finally, when was the impact seen? For instance, as we will see in today's lesson, the economic impacts of industrialization would devastate the Soviet Union in the short run, but in the long run, it could set the Soviet Union up for success in World War II because it became a powerhouse. So short term, it seems like there's a negative impact, but long term, it seems like there's a positive impact. And these are the four different things that you should be considering when you want to evaluate the impact of a policy. So another way we can look at impact is in terms of the different domains or different types of impacts. First, we start off with the political impact. This concerns how power is being distributed in the country. How does the government try to control you? So we will be thinking about things like the government, the laws of the country, and even the police. Next, we will think about economic impact, and that concerns resources like money or jobs. How are they being distributed across the country? Did some people have more economic resources than others, or did some people have less? Finally, we'll look at social impact, and social impact is about society and its people. So we'll be talking about things like women and youth, the different ethnic and racial groups in Soviet Union, and so on. Okay. With that out of the way, let's have a broad overview on what Stalin aimed to do with his dictatorship. The first big aim he had was to consolidate his power. In the previous section of this chapter, we saw how Stalin rose to power, but now that he's risen to power, he's looking to eliminate all opposition, both real and imaginary. Real opposition could be people who actually sought to overthrow Stalin or who actually opposed him, whereas imaginary opposition could be just your average ordinary citizen who may not have an opinion towards Stalin, but Stalin, being paranoid, would try to eliminate them and he would see them as threats. Secondly, he will try to strengthen the support for his power. The second big cluster of aims by Stalin was to modernize the Soviet Union. He wanted the Soviet Union to become self-sufficient. This is in the context of the Soviet Union being isolated by the Western countries because they're all very scared of a communist country and they didn't want to trade with the Soviet Union. In order for the Soviet Union to survive, they needed to make sure that they could rely on themselves, hence be self-sufficient. Secondly, they needed to become militarily strong. So that's the picture on the left. And finally, they wanted to become a socialist state. We will see more about what this means in the later part of the lesson. So here is a broad overview of Stalin's impact. Okay? We split it in terms of economic impact, political, and social. It's always a good idea to see the big picture first and how all of these different parts relate to the Stalin's impact. Okay, this will help you in your revision. Okay, so let's zoom right in. Let's look at the economic impact of Stalin. There are two big questions we're thinking about. The first question is, what were his policies of collectivization and industrialization? You should be able to describe both of these policies in terms of their aims and some key details. Next, you should be able to evaluate whether these policies had successful, unsuccessful, or mixed results. So these are the two questions that you should always answer in your SEQ. In order to understand Stalin's economic impact and in the type of policies he was pushing forth, we have to understand what was Stalin thinking about or what was he worried about. And this quote that he made in February 1931 is a very good quote that shows us his fear of the Western powers. So he says, we are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries like Britain and France and Germany. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, either we improve, or we shall be crushed. So this quote shows us very clearly that Stalin was fearful of being crushed by the Western countries, and this will give him a sense of urgency and a sense of ferocity in pushing his different economic aims. Okay? So he tried to do this through what we call the 5-year plans. He tried to modernize the Soviet Union such that their economy and military would be at the same level of the Western powers. Okay? And these 5-year plans, there are targets that set there are targets on agricultural development, so that's about farms, and industrial development through rapid industrialization. So we'll see this in two parts. So the first policy is on collectivization. So you just see this picture on the left. You see a lot of farmers gathering abundance of wheat. There's so much prosperity going on there. So collectivization is about farms, and rapid industrialization, you see the pictures of the factory in the background, is about coal, iron, steel, and electricity. So let's first look at his policy of collectivization. There are several aims of this policy. The first major aim is to support rapid industrialization. Collectivization, the farming, is actually meant to support the coal and steel industries. How so? It is because he wants to secure the food supply for factory workers. Okay. Also, the aim of collectivization is that when farming becomes more and more efficient, they are able to export these crops to other countries to raise funds for industrialization. And finally, when farming becomes more efficient, more farmers can be converted to support industrialization by becoming factory workers. So let's get an idea of how collectivization is supposed to work using this example. So traditional farming, where peasants or farmers work on individual small farms with their limited technology, is inefficient. So there's this picture of maybe 5 different farms of different sizes. Okay, the one in the middle obviously is a very, very large farm. Okay, so peasants who own the land, who are the richer peasants, we call them kulaks. So let's use this guy as an example. So might be an example of a kulak. He might be able to afford a tractor, whereas the other poorer peasants, they are using things like cows and oxes. Now, when we compare the productivity of these farmers, we would sort of know that the farmer using the tractor is obviously going to be way more productive than the poorer peasants who are using the cows, right? So these richer farmers, what they can do is actually to use money. They can use the money to buy more and more advanced machinery. They can produce more and more food, and then they become richer. Whereas these farmers who are on their cows may not be able to produce more than enough food for export to sell for profit. They might just be able to produce enough food just to support themselves and their families. So what will happen is, like say, this poor farmer using his cows, he has to farm all day long from the start of the morning all the way to the evening, and he has only enough food to support himself. Whereas this dude, because he has a tractor, he's so much more efficient. He could be done with his work maybe by lunch, and then the rest of the day he's free because he's already farmed all the land that he owns. Now, what is Stalin's idea of collectivization? Stalin's idea was to collect all the farms into one gigantic farm. And in this gigantic farm, all of the resources, like the tractor, like the cattle and oxes, would be shared. So in one collective, that's what we call a collective, there'll be 50 to 100 different holdings of individual farms. So the farmer who had the tractor will now have to share the tractor with everybody else. And you can imagine that the poorer peasants will be very happy because now you have access to the tractors, you have other people farming your land. Also, because farming is made so much more efficient, the tractors would decrease the number of people who are needed to farm the lands. For instance, this guy with the tractor, he can farm all 5 farms, whereas previously these individual farmers had to farm. Okay, what does this mean in terms of manpower? Because of mechanization, because you can now use machines in your work, these 4 farmers are now out of a job. They don't need to be farming anymore because one dude with a tractor can do their job. In this case, now these 4 guys, they're going to become extra labor that can join the cities to support industrialization. They can become workers in the factories. So that's what collectivization is about. Large farms created from the merger of small individual farms and is made more efficient through mechanization. That means you use machines like tractors. And by 1935, almost all the farms in the Soviet Union were already collectivized. And this can take place because the Soviet Union is a socialist state. This means that the state owns all the land and the state collects and distributes the crops. Okay. Now, what does this further mean? Because all things are being owned by the state has the right to set quotas for the quantities of crops that farmers were expected to produce. They'll tell you at the end of every week, you're supposed to produce maybe 200 kg of wheat or 200 kg of potatoes. Okay. Moreover, they'll set your working hours and the wages of your farmers. Okay. And for those who fail to meet their quotas, meet the targets, or they were absent from work, there will be severe punishments. Okay. So that's a description of what collectivization is about. Now let's evaluate it. Let's evaluate its economic impact. Was it successful? Was it a failure? The first thing we note that was collectivization successfully supported industrialization. Because farming became more and more efficient, the state was able to collect the grain it needed to feed the workers in the industrial towns, and crops produced could be exported for profit to buy industrial equipment. Also, because farming was so much more efficient, manpower in the factories could be found because the peasants no longer had a job in the countryside. They can move over to the cities. The downside, of course, is that there was a massive failure because of the destruction of Soviet agriculture. You see in this picture, the broad headline says 6 million perish in Soviet famine. Peasants' crops are seized, they are taken away by the state, they and their animals starve. And this is a picture of the of Ukraine, an area in the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was actually previously known as the bread basket of Europe, meaning the Ukraine was supposed to be the most productive place for farming and growing. But under the collectivization policies, the harsh collectivization policies, it led to a famine. And it led to also acts of cannibalism. You can see that, right? Hunger, despair, and death in Ukraine. Soviet starving tells their own stories. Some of them were jailed for eating dogs. So what contributed to this? In 1932 and 1933, there was a bad harvest, and that led to the Great Famine, which eventually led to the deaths of about 7 to 10 million people. Grain harvest dropped dramatically between 1931 to 34, and it wouldn't recover to the 1928 levels until 1950. This means that the situation was so bad, it took them about, 20 plus years to recover. And the loss of animal production was not recovered until after World War II in 1945. Now, you can imagine the effect of this on the Soviet peasants. The Soviet peasants are already struggling with famine, and yet they are being forced to surrender their farm produce to meet the quotas. It led to such a desperate state that many peasants, instead of choosing to just hand over their quotas to the communist officials, they would rather kill their own farm animals, bury their own grains, and hide their burial crops in the ground. This is actually suicidal, right? You can just think about that. They're killing their own animals. They're not being able to farm for themselves anymore. And that shows you the level of opposition the peasants had towards the Soviet state. And that sums up collectivization. Now, let's think about industrialization. So, the aims of industrialization were to focus on developing heavy industries like coal, iron, steel, and electricity. And we must understand industrialization as working together with collectivization. So here's a brief graph on how collectivization and industrialization work together. Okay. So at collectivization, what happens is they try to introduce modern machines like tractors into the farms. And what happens as a result is that farming becomes more and more efficient. So less farmers are needed. They can go to the factories to become factory workers. They can produce more and more steel and coal. At the same time, because of the machines, there can be an increased food supply to the cities and factories, and the excess crops can be sold to gain revenue. And the factories in the cities can be used to produce more and more farming machinery that feeds back to make farming more and collectivization more and more efficient. So you see, this is a happy cycle. This slide shows you an overview of the 5-year plans. Under Stalin's rule, there were three main 5-year plans: the first, second, and third. The third one, however, we note that it's going to be disrupted by World War II. We'll see a bit of this in chapter 4 of your content. Okay. Under industrialization, the Soviet Union pushed forth propaganda campaigns that tried to encourage workers to work harder and more efficiently. And they talked a lot about these shock workers. Okay, you might see this in some of your sources. The shock workers refer to those who exceeded their targets. They were being used as their model Soviet citizens that everybody was supposed to learn from, and everybody would be motivated to follow. Okay. So while you're encouraged to follow the shock workers, you will also discourage from slacking off because of severe punishments. So let's evaluate the impact of industrialization. Did it help the Soviet Union? Did it not help the Soviet Union? Did it help the workers? Did it not help the workers? Okay. So the first success is that the economy was expanded, hundreds of factories were built, and the industrial workforce, this means the number of people who were working, was expanded. And we must bear in mind that this was taking place in the 1930s, where the capitalist Western countries like Germany, like France, like Britain, millions of them were becoming unemployed and becoming jobless because of the Great Depression. So these guys in the Western countries were looking over their shoulders and looking at the Soviet Union and wondering, wow, look at this communist state. They seem to be doing so well, they seem to be producing so much, and they seem to be solving the problem of unemployment. The other success was that the Soviet Union was able to catch up to the Western powers. And you see this table on the left, it shows you the production of coal, steel, and oil and electricity, and how the original targets were set, and the actual targets of what they managed to achieve was far greater than what they originally set. And this shows you how the Soviet Union became a very powerful arms industry, like weapons industry, by 1941. By 1939, it overtook Britain and Germany in terms of industrial output. So remember the quote at the start of the lesson. It talks about how Stalin was afraid that the Western countries would crush them. Well, Soviet Union now has overtaken both of these guys in terms of industrial output. And the long-term benefit of industrialization is that the Soviet Union becomes strong enough to defeat Germany in World War II. Okay, this is a long-term impact. Some of the failures of industrialization, however, included the wastage of products and the poor quality of products. So because everybody was rushing to try to meet the production figures, this led to very low quality products and sometimes even dangerous products. Also, Soviet production was characterized by poor coordination across the economy and poor planning by the managers. This is because the different managers were competing to try to meet their own targets. So in some cases, this will lead to a shortage of materials, and then that leads to underproduction of materials. Other factories, because they're very kanchong, they want to exceed their targets, they overproduce. And so this leads to a lot of wastage. Another point of failure or negative impact of industrialization is the fall in workers' living standards. So, because the state sets quotas and sets and fixes the working hours and wages of the workers lived in very challenging work environments. It was very difficult working conditions. And in terms of living conditions, remember that a lot of these workers had been farmers who have moved to the city to find jobs. However, the Soviet state did not provide them enough living areas, and hence they lived in overcrowded living conditions. Okay? And personal freedoms were also restricted there. Now, how would Russian society view industrialization and collectivization? Simply put, they hated it. Forced collectivization, low wages, and harsh treatment strained the relationship between the Communist Party and the people. We recall that during the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, he promised peace to the Russian people, peace being get them out of World War One. He also promised them bread and promised them land. However, under collectivization and industrialization, they had neither bread nor land. There was a famine, and all the land was being taken up and owned by the state. And so the Central Communist Party had difficulties getting the local leaders, the local party secretaries, to meet the high grain collection targets and to identify the kulaks, the ones who were supposedly sabotaging the communist efforts. And by the end of 1933, the Communist Party had become extremely unpopular because the economic impacts of collectivization and industrialization were not being supported by the party and the Soviet people. Now, this then leads us to the question, how is Stalin going to deal with this, with his growing unpopularity? How is he going to enforce and make sure that nobody is going to try to overthrow him because they did not like his policies? And that will be the focus of the next lesson.